On the other side of the world, there is a country called Happy Land, where the trees are 100 feet tall, and where the sun shines hotter than here. And, as you might very well expect, everybody who lives in Happy Land is as happy as the day is long. Wherever you go, you see smiling faces all around. It's such a happy place that even the flowers seem to smile in Happy Land. And as well as all the people being happy, all the animals in Happy Land are happy as well. If you've never seen a mouse smile, or a cat, or a dog, or even a worm, you go to Happy Land. Now, this story is about somebody who lives there, and who happens to be called Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy is fat, and round, and happy. He lives in a small cottage beside a lake at the foot of a mountain and close to a wood. One day, while Mr. Happy was out walking through the tall trees in those woods near his home, he came across something which was really rather extraordinary. There, in the trunk of one of the very tall trees, was a door. Not a very large door, but nevertheless, a door. A small, narrow, yellow door. I wonder who lives here, thought Mr. Happy to himself. And he turned the handle of that small, narrow, yellow door. The door wasn't locked, and it swung open quite easily. Mr. Happy squeezed his rather large body through the rather thin doorway. Just inside the small, narrow yellow door was a small, narrow, winding staircase leading downwards. The stairs went round and round and down and down and round and round and down and down. Eventually, after a long time, Mr. Happy reached the bottom of the staircase. He looked around and saw, there in front of him, another small, narrow door, but this one was red. Mr. Happy knocked at the door. "Who's there?" said a voice. Sad, squeaky sort of voice. "Who's there?" Mr. Happy pushed open the red door slowly. And who do you think he saw? There, sitting on a stool, was somebody who looked exactly like Mr. Happy, except that he didn't look happy at all. In fact, he looked downright miserable. "Hello, Mr. Happy." "I'm Mr. Happy." "Oh, how are you indeed?" sniffed the person who looked like Mr. Happy but wasn't. "Well, my name's Mr. Miserable, and I'm the most miserable person in the world." "Why are you so miserable?" asked Mr. Happy. "Because I am," replied Mr. Miserable. "How would you like to be happy, like me?" asked Mr. Happy. "I'd give anything to be happy," said Mr. Miserable. "Well, I'm so miserable I don't think I ever could be happy," he added miserably. Mr. Happy made up his mind quickly. "Follow me," he said. "Where to?" asked Mr. Miserable. "Don't argue," said Mr. Happy. And he went out through the small, narrow red door. Mr. Miserable hesitated, and then followed. Up and up the winding staircase they went. Up and round and round and up and round and round and up until they came out through the yellow door and into the wood. "Follow me," said Mr. Happy again, and they both set off through the wood back to Mr. Happy's cottage. Mr. Miserable stayed in Mr. Happy's cottage for quite some time. And during that time, the most remarkable thing happened. Because he was living in Happy Land, Mr. Miserable, ever so slowly, stopped being miserable. The corners of his mouth stopped turning down, and ever so slowly started turning up. And eventually, Mr. Miserable did something that he'd never done in the whole of his life. He smiled. And then he chuckled, which turned into a giggle, which became a laugh. A big, booming, hearty, huge, giant, large, enormous laugh. And Mr. Happy was so surprised that he started to laugh as well. Both of them laughed and laughed. They laughed. They laughed until their sides hurt and their eyes watered. Mr. Miserable laughed and laughed and laughed, and Mr. Happy laughed and laughed and laughed, and because they were laughing so much, everybody who saw them started laughing as well. Even the birds started, the trees started to laugh at the thought of somebody called Mr. Miserable who just couldn't stop laughing. That really is the end of the story. Except to say that if ever you feel as miserable as Mr. Miserable, well, you know exactly what to do, don't you? Just turn the corners of your mouth up. Go on. Try it. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as it can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are red, and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forward. Really is a very silly place indeed. Which, of course, is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest-looking house you've ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier-looking house than this? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land each year they hold a competition. And the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly had never won the cup, but each night, lying in his bed, he dreamed about winning it. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, into which he put a spoonful of marmalade. After that, he had a cornflake sandwich. And to finish, he had a boiled egg. But
Being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Now, isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was a friend of Mr. Silly's, had won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly thought and thought. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade. That didn't help either. So, he decided to take a walk. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella, he said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken. Because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. It was in the middle of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he'd ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. Huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The king of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform. One of the silliest ideas of the year is by Mr. Muddle, the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple. The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everybody to see. He felt sure that he was going to win. However, said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell, we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop. It was a teapot, quite the silliest teapot there had ever been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. I therefore have great pleasure, announced the king, in presenting the Nonsense Cup to... Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now, in the middle of the square, there is a tree. It's always been there. And it was at this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. What, he cried, has happened to that tree? Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves. Bright green leaves. Not red leaves, like all the trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was a gasp from the crowd. It was me, piped up Mr. Silly. I painted all the leaves green last night when you were all asleep. A green tree, exclaimed the king. Who ever heard of a green tree? A green tree, shouted the crowd. How silly! And they started to applaud wildly. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. I think, he said, that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of. And therefore, I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr... What did he say his name was? To Mr. Silly. The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went big with pride. And a bird, perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree, looked down. Woof, it said, and flew off, backwards. Mr. Jelly was frightened of everything and anything. At the slightest little thing, he would quiver and tremble and shake, turn to jelly. So it's not really surprising to find that Mr. Jelly lives as far away from anybody as he can. In the middle of a wood, miles and miles from anywhere. This story begins one morning when Mr. Jelly was asleep. It was a beautiful autumn morning. The sun was shining, the leaves on the trees had turned to a glorious red, and the wind stirred gently in the treetops. A single leaf fell gently from the tree right outside Mr. Jelly's house and quietly brushed against his bedroom window as it fell. Mr. Jelly awoke with a start. What? What's that terrible noise? Oh, heaven! Oh, the house is falling down. It's an earthquake. It's the end of the world. Oh! And he hid under the bedclothes, trembling with fright. After an hour, by which time he realized that his house wasn't falling down and that there wasn't an earthquake and the world wasn't coming to an end, Mr. Jelly peeped out from under the bedclothes. Phew, he said. Oh, thank goodness for that. And he got up and went downstairs to make his breakfast. After breakfast, Mr. Jelly thought he'd go for a walk. He was walking through the woods which surround his house when a worm poked its head out of the ground. Morning, said the worm cheerfully. Mr. Jelly? Mr. Jelly nearly jumped out of his skin. What? Who's there? Then he saw the worm. Oh, good heavens, it's a snake, a man-eating snake. Oh, I'm going to be eaten alive. He jumped up into a tree. What a performance, commented the worm, and went back into his hole. After an hour, Mr. Jelly felt brave enough to climb down from the tree and continue his walk. Eventually, he came out of the other side of the wood and into a field. It was an empty field. Or was it? In the long grass in the middle of the field, unseen by Mr. Jelly, there was a tramp enjoying a sleep in the autumn sunshine. Mr. Jelly picked his way cautiously through the grass. The tramp, fast asleep, snored. What was that? What was that? Shrieked Mr. Jelly. It's a lion. I heard it growl. Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, dear me, a huge lion with enormous teeth. A huge lion with enormous sharp teeth that's going to bite me in two. A huge, ferocious lion with enormous sharp teeth that's going to bite me in two, if not three. And he fainted. All this commotion awakened the tramp, who yawned, stretched, sat up, and saw Mr. Jelly lying on the ground beside him. Oh, dear, he said. But he was a kindly tramp. Oh, dearie me. And he picked up Mr. Jelly and placed him gently in the palm of his hand. Mr. Jelly came to and sat up, rubbing his eyes. And then he saw the tramp's face looking at him. Oh, disaster. Oh, he screamed. Oh, calamity. It's a giant, an ogre. Oh, gracious, he's going to have me for breakfast. My, said the tramp gently. You're a nervous little chap now, aren't you? What's your name? It's Mr. Jelly. Mr. Jelly. Stammered Mr. Jelly. Now, I used to be nervous like you, said the tramp, but I learned how not to be. Would you like me to tell you the secret? Mr. Jelly quivered and shook and said, yes, please. It's very simple, continued the tramp. All you have to do is to count up to 10, and you'll find that whatever's frightening you isn't quite so frightening after all. Then he set Mr. Jelly gently down on the grass. Now remember, he said to Mr. Jelly, count to 10. And off he went. Mr. Jelly thought that it would be a very good idea if he went home. Back across the field he went. Back through the woods he went. He was walking through the woods when he stepped on a little twig. Snap! Went the twig. Mr. Jelly jumped twice his own height in terror. What's that? He shrieked. That terrible snapping noise. It's a tree falling down. It's going to crush me to pieces. Oh, it's a crocodile hiding in the bushes, snapping its teeth. Oh, more. Then he stopped, took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, he said. And he saw that what had gone snap was a twig, a silly old twig. Phew, he said. Mr. Jelly had almost reached his house when a leaf drifted gently down from a tree on top of him. Oh, help, help! Police! Murder! He screamed. I'm being kidnapped! Oh, it's ruffians and guns! They're going to... And then he stopped. He took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then he saw that what had fallen on him was only a leaf. Nothing but a leaf. A stupid red leaf. It works, he said out loud in wonderment. And you know, it did. He never shrieks or shouts or screams or quivers or shakes or trembles anymore. In fact, he's become quite firm. And he never hides under the bedclothes. Well, not very often, anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. One night, 2 days before Christmas, it started to snow. All night it snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed. Millions and billions and trillions of big white soft snowflakes covered the whole wide world. When morning came, it was quite amazing to see just how much snow had fallen. All the houses, all the trees, all the roads and all the fields were covered. It was almost as if a huge white blanket had been gently laid over everything. Everywhere you looked was white. And then the sun came out. And so did the children. They were all dressed up and muffled up, wearing scarves and woolies and gloves and boots so that they wouldn't catch cold. All the children were so excited to see so much snow, which isn't surprising, really, because there was more snow than there'd ever been before. Some of them went on their sledges, racing down the hills. Some of them, who didn't have sledges, threw snowballs at each other. One little boy even made a snowball that was as big as himself. And some of the children made snowmen. Then it was Christmas Eve. The children all went home early so that they could go to bed early, so that they could get up early to see what Father Christmas had brought them. But that particular Christmas Eve, Father Christmas was in trouble. And the trouble was that it had snowed so much that Father Christmas was stuck. Well, and truly stuck. There was so much snow that his reindeer simply couldn't pull his sleigh, piled high with all the presents that he had to deliver to all the children. Oh dear, thought Father Christmas to himself. Oh dear me, what am I to do? He sat down on his sack of toys and thought how he could manage to deliver all the presents to all the children before they woke up on Christmas morning. Oh, dear. Oh, dear me. He said out loud and sighed. Now, it just so happened that Father Christmas had got himself stuck just beside a snowman which one of the children had built. And that gave him an idea. A good idea. A very good idea. A very good idea indeed. How would you like to help me? He asked the snowman. But of course the snowman didn't answer because snowmen can't talk, can they? Of course I'll have to use some of my magic to bring him to life, thought Father Christmas to himself. So he tugged his white beard 3 times and muttered some Father Christmassy magic words into it. Suddenly, you might almost say magically, the snowman did come to life. Hello, Father Christmas, said Mr. Snow, which was the snowman's name. You look sort of stuck, if you ask me, which you haven't, but I'll say so anyway. And if you ask me again, I'd say you need a sort of helping hand, if you know what I mean, which you probably do, because that's probably why you brought me to life, which you certainly did. So can I be of any assistance? Mr. Snow, you might have gathered, was a rather talkative sort of snowman. Exactly, beamed Father Christmas. Let's get started. And start they did. Mr. Snow gave Father Christmas an enormous push, and off they went. And they divided the work between them. It was Mr. Snow's job to see that all the right toys for all the right boys and all the right toys for all the right girls were put into all the right sacks. It was Father Christmas's job to make sure that he took all the right sacks down all the right chimneys and delivered all the right toys to all the right boys and all the right toys to all the right girls. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Susan got her teddy bear. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Peter got his train. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas even made sure that little Jane got her squeaky pink elephant to play with in the bath. And then, all of a sudden, they discovered that between them, they'd finished. Oh, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for helping me deliver all the right toys to all the right boys, said Father Christmas, shaking Mr. Snow by the hand. No, not forgetting all the right toys to all the right girls, replied Mr. Snow, shaking Father Christmas by the hand. And now, I'd better turn you back into a snowman again, said Father Christmas. Thank you again. And goodbye. My pleasure, smiled Mr. Snow. And do you know, from that Christmas to this Christmas, Father Christmas always chooses a snowman to help him. So, if you ever build a snowman, you'd better make sure that you build him properly. Because who knows? He might be Mr. Snow. Mr. Bounce was very small, and like a rubber ball. He just couldn't keep himself on the ground. He bounced
bounced all over the place. And, as you can imagine, that made things rather difficult. Last week, for instance, Mr. Bounce was out walking when he came to a farm. He climbed over the farm gate, and you can guess what happened next, can't you? He jumped down from the gate and bounced right into the duck pond. Quack, went the ducks. The other morning, for instance, Mr. Bounce was in bed. He woke up and jumped out of bed, and you can guess what happened next, can't you? He bounced right out of his bedroom door and all the way downstairs. Bouncety, 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 bounce. Well, that happens quite often, which probably explains why Mr. Bounce leaves his bedroom door open every night. After he'd picked himself up, Mr. Bounce went and sat down to think. Mr. Bounce bounced off the chair and banged his head on the ceiling. Ouch! Said Mr. Bounce. Oh, this is ridiculous, Mr. Bounce thought to himself, rubbing his head. I must do something to stop all this bouncing about. He thought and thought. I know, he thought. I'll go and see the doctor. So, after breakfast, Mr. Bounce set off to the nearest town to see the doctor. He was passing a tennis court when he tripped over a pebble. And he bounced right onto the court where two children were playing tennis. And you can guess what happened next, can't you? The children didn't realize that Mr. Bounce wasn't a tennis ball and started hitting him with their tennis racket. Backwards and forwards over the net. Oh! Ow! Ouch! Poor Mr. Bounce. Eventually, one of the children hit Mr. Bounce so hard, he bounced right out of the tennis court. Mr. Bounce bounced off down the road towards the town. Oh, dear, he said, feeling very sorry for himself. I've been bounced black and blue. A bus was coming down the road. Mr. Bounce decided that the safest place for him to be would be on it. He got on and sat down, still feeling more than a little sorry for himself. The bus drove into town. The bus stopped right outside the doctor's. Mr. Bounce stepped down from the bus and onto the pavement and bounced in through the doctor's window. Dr. Makuwell was sitting at his desk enjoying his mid-morning cup of coffee. Mr. Bounce sailed through the open window. Splash went the coffee. Ow! Squeaked Mr. Bounce. Coffee was rather hot. Good heavens! Exclaimed Dr. Makuwell. After the doctor had fished Mr. Bounce out of his coffee and set him on some blotting paper to dry out, he listened to what Mr. Bounce had to tell him. So, you see, said Mr. Bounce finally, you must give me something to stop me bouncing about all over the place quite so much. Pondered the doctor. After some thought, Dr. Makuwell went to his medicine cabinet and took out a pair of tiny red boots. This should do the trick, he told Mr. Bounce. Heavy boots. That should stop the bouncing. Oh, thank you, Dr. Makuwell, said Mr. Bounce, and walked home wearing his red boots. No, not bounced. Walked. That night, Mr. Bounce went to bed wearing his heavy boots. And then he went to sleep. The following morning, he woke up, yawned, stretched, and bounced out of bed. And he went straight through the bedroom floorboards. And finished up in the kitchen. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-Me-Not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep, Mr. Forgetful. He was having a dream. Then the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. He yawned, and stretched his arms, and tried to remember what he'd been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't. Because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face. But he'd forgotten where the bathroom was in his house. Do you know what he did? He walked into the wardrobe. Oh, silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom and washed his face. He even remembered to clean his teeth. Then he went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread. But, of course, he forgot about it. And it was burned. He boiled himself an egg. But, of course, he forgot about it, and it was hard-boiled. Mr. Forgetful had burnt toast and hard-boiled eggs for breakfast every day. It was such a lovely day, Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down to the village to buy a stamp for a letter he'd written 3 weeks ago but had forgotten to post. So off he set. And did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage behind him? Of course he didn't. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Mrs. Parcel in the village post office. What can I do for you this fine morning? Oh, I'd like... I've forgotten, he said. A stamp? Suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp. Yeah, that's what I was trying to remember not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful had some more shopping to do, but could he remember what it was that he was supposed to remember not to forget to shop for? Of course he couldn't. So he decided to go home. On his way, he met the village policeman going the other way. Morning, Mr. Forgetful, said the policeman. Will you give Farmer Fields a message from me on your way home, please? Farmer Fields had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd never had a message to remember in his life before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself, trying to remember the message as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. 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 Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over to himself.
Eventually, he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. "Mr. Fields," he said, there's a goose asleep in the rain." Farmer Fields couldn't believe his ears. "A goose asleep in the rain?" repeated Farmer Fields slowly. "But I don't have any geese. And anyway, it isn't raining." "You sure that was the message?" Poor Mr. Forgetful. He got it all wrong. And he couldn't remember how to get it all right. Simply couldn't remember at all. So off he went home. Poor Mr. Forgetful. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Fields' farm, feeling very sorry for himself. "Oh, I do wish I could remember things," he thought. He was so busy feeling sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped into it and fell over. "Bother! Bah! How silly, letting a sheep loose in the lane," thought Mr. Forgetful. And then he remembered the message. He jumped up and ran back along the lane to the farm as fast as he could. "Mr. Fields! Mr. Fields!" called as he ran into the farmyard. "Mr. Fields, there's a goose asleep in the rain." He'd forgotten again. Mr. Fields scratched his head. "Come with me. Come on," cried Mr. Forgetful, and pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. "There it is," cried Mr. Forgetful. But a goose." And then he stopped. "Oh dear," he said, "No, it's not a goose, is it? That's a sheep." He blushed. "I think," smiled Farmer Fields, "that you're the goose." And he chuckled. Even the sheep started to laugh. It was so funny. Later that day, Mr. Forgetful sat down in his favourite armchair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage to think about what a funny day it had been. And he giggled and giggled the more he thought about that goose asleep in that goose asleep in the train. Oh dear. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Funny lived in a teapot. It had 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room, and it suited Mr. Funny very nicely. One day, Mr. Funny was having lunch. He wasn't very hungry, so he only had a daisy sandwich and a glass of toast. "Delicious," he murmured to himself as he finished his funny lunch. After lunch, Mr. Funny decided to go for a drive in his car. Mr. Funny's car was a shoe. Have you ever seen a car that looks like a shoe? It looks very funny. As he drove along, everybody who saw him laughed to see such a funny sight. He passed a worm at the side of the road. The worm thought Mr. Funny in his funny car was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. He nearly laughed himself in two. He passed a pig in a field. The Pig thought Mr. Funny in his funny car was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. She nearly laughed her tail off. Even the flowers he passed thought that Mr. Funny was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen. They nearly laughed themselves out of the ground. Eventually, Mr. Funny came to some crossroads. He didn't know which way to go, so he looked at the signpost. One of the signs said, "To the zoo." "Oh, that'd be fun," thought Mr. Funny to himself. So he drove his shoe towards the zoo. When he arrived at the gate of the zoo, he stopped. It was closed. "I'm sorry," said the zookeeper. "But we had to close the zoo because all the animals have a cold. They're all feeling very sorry for themselves." "Oh, dear," said Mr. Funny. And then he thought. "Perhaps I could help to cheer them up," he said. "Well," said the zookeeper, "worth a try, I suppose." And he opened the gate. Mr. Funny drove into the zoo in his shoes. First thing he saw was an elephant. It was true. The elephant was feeling very sorry for herself. Very sorry indeed. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking elephant. And the sad-looking elephant stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh, dear. Then, do you know what Mr. Funny did? He pulled a funny face. Mr. Funny, as you can imagine, is very good at pulling funny faces. The elephant giggled. He'd never seen anything so funny. Mr. Funny pulled another funny face. And the elephant burst out laughing. The elephant laughed and laughed and laughed. Oh, he laughed so hard, she nearly laughed her trunk off. Oh, and she felt a lot better. Mr. Funny went over to the lion house. There was a lion, feeling extraordinarily sorry for himself. Mr. Funny stood and looked at the sad-looking lion, and the sad-looking lion stood and looked at Mr. Funny. Oh, dear. And then Mr. Funny pulled the funniest-looking face that's probably ever been pulled anywhere, ever. Now, you've heard a lion roar before, haven't you? Well, this lion roared, too, with laughter. He laughed so hard, he did laughed his whiskers to pieces. And then Mr. Funny went round to see all the other animals in the zoo. Oh, dear, what a miserable-looking lot. For all of them, Mr. Funny pulled funnier and funnier faces. The big brown pig giggled, then burst out laughing, and the giraffe laughed so hard she nearly laughed her neck into a knot. And the hippopotamus nearly laughed himself out of his skin, and the penguins nearly laughed their flippers floppy. The leopard. You should have seen him. He laughed so hard, he nearly laughed his spots off. His spots off. Oh, what a pandemonium. Oh, Mr. Funny, giggled the zookeeper, who'd started laughing as well. Oh, Mr. Funny, thank you very, very much indeed, sir, for coming to cheer us all up. Oh, nothing really, replied Mr. Funny modestly, and drove off in his shoe. Later, when Mr. Funny arrived home, he chuckled to himself. Well, he said, well, that's the end of another funny day. And he parked his shoe and went inside his teapot. And because he was feeling thirsty, he made himself a nice hot cup of cake.
This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump walking down the street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home. But even there, he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. I must fix that before it falls off, thought Mr. Bump to himself. And he hurried off to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash went the living room window. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump. And he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again. And he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up onto the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost, or broken, or splintered, chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or torn, or burst, or wrenched, or crunched, or split, or slit, guess who got the blame? For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm. He tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk. And the farm cat lapped it up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in the pillar box. They had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to go away for a holiday. There, he could think about what sort of job he could do where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So he set off to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea, and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket. And as he couldn't get it off, He had to hop round with it on his foot for hours. And as he hopped along the beach, he hopped straight into a large hole that somebody had dug. And he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday. And while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of a job he should do. It was quite the best idea Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. And now, Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley has rather a large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples. But he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples, like other apple pickers. Oh, no. No, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Down falls an apple. And Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of picking apples much easier. Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So, you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all, is it? Ooh, ooh. It was a warm, sunny morning. In his small house at the other side of the wood, Mr. Tickle was asleep. You didn't know that there was such a thing as a tickle, did you? Oh, well, there is. Tickles are small and round, and they have arms that stretch and stretch and stretch. Extraordinarily long arms. Mr. Tickle was fast asleep. He was having a dream. It must have been a very funny dream, because it made him laugh out loud. And that woke him up. He sat up in bed, stretched his extraordinarily long arms, and yawned an enormous yawn. Mr. Tickle felt hungry, so do you know what he did? He reached out one of his extraordinarily long arms, opened the bedroom door, reached down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, reached into the kitchen cupboard, opened the biscuit tin, took out a biscuit, brought it back upstairs, and back to Mr. Tickle. As you can see, it's very useful indeed, having arms as long as Mr. Tickle's. Mr. Tickle munched his biscuit. He looked out of the window. Today looks very much like a tickling day, he thought to himself. So, later that morning, after Mr. Tickle had made his bed and cooked his breakfast, he set off through the wood. As he walked along, he kept his eyes very wide open.
looking for somebody to tickle. Looking for anybody to tickle. Eventually, Mr. Tickle came to a school. There was nobody about, so, reaching up his extraordinarily long arms to a high window ledge, Mr. Tickle pulled himself up and peeked in through the open window. Inside, he could see a classroom. There were children sitting at their desks and a teacher writing on the blackboard. Mr. Tickle reached in through the window with that extraordinarily long arm of his, went up behind a little boy called Peter, and tickled him on the back of his neck. Peter giggled out loud. "Stop that giggling at once," said the teacher sternly. Mr. Tickle waited a minute, then reached in through the window again. Mr. Tickle's extraordinarily long arm went right up to the teacher, paused, and then tickled. The teacher jumped in the air and turned round very quickly to see who was there. But there was nobody there. Mr. Tickle grinned a mischievous grin. He waited another minute and then tickled the teacher again. This time he kept on tickling, until soon the teacher was laughing out loud and saying, "Oh, stop it! Stop it, over! Stop it!" over and over and over again. All the children were laughing too at such a funny sight. There was a terrible pandemonium. Eventually, Mr. Tickle thought he'd had enough fun. So he gave the teacher one more tickle for luck, and then very quietly brought his arm back through the open window. Chuckling to himself, he jumped down from the window, leaving the poor teacher to explain what it was all about, which of course he couldn't. Then Mr. Tickle went to town. And what a day Mr. Tickle had. He tickled a policeman on traffic duty at the crossroads in the middle of the town. It caused an enormous traffic jam. He tickled a greengrocer just as he was piling apples neatly in his shop window. The greengrocer fell over backwards, and the apples rolled all over the shop. There were apples everywhere. At the railway station, the guard was about to wave his flag for the train to leave. As he lifted his arm in the air, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And every time he tried to wave his flag, Mr. Tickle tickled him. And tickled him again. Until the train was 10 minutes late, and all the passengers were absolutely furious. That day, Mr. Tickle tickled everybody. He tickled the doctor. He tickled the butcher. He even tickled old Mr. Stamp, the postman, who dropped all his letters into a puddle. Then Mr. Tickle went home. Sitting in his armchair in his small house at the other side of the wood, he laughed and laughed and laughed every time he thought about all the people he'd tickled. Oh, dear. Oh, Mr. Small was very small. He lived in a small house underneath a daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it suited Mr. Small very well indeed. He liked living there. Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of a job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't that many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but hadn't had any ideas, not one. He was thinking about it now, while he was having lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty. So he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself. After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So after lunch, he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, whom he knew quite well. "Out for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "Going to see Mr. Robinson," replied Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter the worm, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he'd rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all of the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was the doorbell. "How can I ring the bell when I can't reach it?" thought Mr. Small to himself. Just then, Mr. Small heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. The postman looked down. "Hello," he said to Mr. Small. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me?" "Of course I will," replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question. And reaching out, he pressed the bell with his finger. "Thank you," said Mr. Small. "My pleasure," said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. Mr. Robinson looked out. "That's funny," he said. "I'm sure I heard somebody ring the bell." He was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down. "Hello," he said. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to ask your advice," said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "you'd better come in, have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house, and, perched on the arm of Mr. Robinson's favourite chair, he told him how he couldn't think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. "So you see," Mr. Small explained, "how difficult it is." "Yes, yes, I can see that," said Mr. Robinson. "But leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots and getting covered in mustard, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the sweet jars, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes. But Mr. Small kept getting shut into boxes with the matches, so he left that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked on a farm and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he left that job. "What are we going to do with you?" Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Small one evening. "Don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know somebody who writes stories for children. Perhaps you could work for him." So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's stories. "Can I work for you?" Mr. Small asked the man. "Yes, you can," replied the man. "Pass me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. And then I'll write a story about it. I'll call it Mr. Small," he added. "But children won't want to hear a story all about me," exclaimed Mr. Small. "Yes, they will," replied the man. "They'll like it very much. And you did, didn't you?" Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he'd been. Oh, yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. Paint was peeling, windows were broken. There were tiles missing from the roof. The flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and the garden gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's messy house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest-looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Morning. I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, peering out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy. "And the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," added Mr. Tidy. Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you, said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. But I know one thing is neat and tidy, said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. Nonsense, said Mr. Tidy. Fiddlesticks, said Mr. Neat. But, said Mr. Messy. Come along, said Mr. Neat. Off we go, said Mr. Tidy. But, said Mr. Messy. But nothing, said Mr. Neat. And bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house on the other side of the wood. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat, when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. God gracious me, added Mr. Tidy. This is the messiest house I've ever seen in all my born days, they both said together at the same time. Better do something about it, said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleared and dug and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the house of Mr. Messy look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking, Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, said Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, boy, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that, now the house is so neat and tidy, you are much too messy to live in it. But, said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was as bright as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed, and brushed, and cleaned, and scrubbed, and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now, he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. And they chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And Mr. Messy laughed. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed. And they all laughed together and became the best of friends. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became, and so it went on. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. As usual, he'd been dreaming about food, and that made him wake up feeling hungry. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. Marmalade, 1 pot. Toast, 6 slices. That was a delicious breakfast. Now, I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided, in order to work up an appetite for lunch, that he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that there before. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Very, very steep, very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing. Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small, and then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of the gigantic table was the most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get up onto that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages the size of pillows. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls. And huge, enormous, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real live giant.
And who
Thundered the giant.
are you?
Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. Mr. Greedy, he squeaked. The giant laughed, a laugh as loud as thunder.
Greedy by name and greedy by nature,
He bellowed.
Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson.
And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he'd finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute.
"No," said the giant in a much quieter voice. "Do you promise never to be greedy again?"
Oh, yes, moaned Mr. Greedy. I promise.
"Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go."
Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat.
And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants.
Then I'll let you go.
This is Coldland, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Coldland is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing. And when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So you can imagine how cold it is. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody who lives there is cold as well. You can tell if somebody comes from Coldland because everybody there has a red nose. And people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. Achoo! The sound of the sneeze is very common indeed in Coldland, which is not very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr. Sneeze, who lived in a small snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning, Mr. Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing. I don't like this sneezing all the time, he thought to himself every day. Until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try to find a cure for the sneezes. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Coldland, and then he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days until Coldland was far behind. As he walked away from Coldland, he noticed that there was less and less snow. And eventually, he walked so far that there was no snow at all. And as he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing. He was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not at all, not a bit, not even the tiniest tissue. I wonder why I'm not sneezing, he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself, because a voice behind him replied, "You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold." Mr. Sneeze jumped, turned,
And there behind him stood a wise old wizard.
What's a cold?
Asked Mr. Sneeze. A cold is what you catch when you're too cold, said the wise old wizard, wisely.
Oh,
Said Mr. Sneeze.
but I come from a country called Cold Land, where everybody's too cold all the time.
Nonsense, snorted the wizard. Can't be too cold all the time, because of the sun. And he pointed to the sun, which was smiling in the sky.
But we don't have any sun in Cold Land.
Said Mr. Sneeze. No sun? Exclaimed the wizard. How extremely extraordinarily extraordinary. We'd better do something about that, then. Hadn't we?
Yes.
Agreed Mr. Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about. How far away is this place called... what is it? Cold Land? Asked the wizard.
Oh, it's miles and miles and miles away.
Replied Mr. Sneeze. In which direction? Asked the wizard. Mr. Sneeze pointed. Oh, it shouldn't take long, said the wizard, who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if you knew what they were. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both the wizard and Mr. Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which you will remember is the capital of Cold Land. As usual, it was snowing. I say, this is a cold, gloomy place, said the wizard. Replied Mr. Sneeze, who'd started sneezing again. Achoo! Cold Land certainly needs some sunshine, said the wizard. That's going to take some rather special magic.
Please hurry up.
Said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman. Now, said the wizard, ignoring him, I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards. The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if you knew what they were. Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind the big black clouds, and it stopped snowing. There now, said the wizard. That should stop the sneezing. And then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting even to say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. After that, the sun shone every day, and today Cold Land isn't anything like it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats chasing red-nosed mice anymore. And these days the sound of the sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. And that isn't the only thing different about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? This is the story of Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong is the strongest person in the whole wide world. The strongest person that ever has been, and probably the strongest person that ever will be. He is so strong that he can not only bend an iron bar with his bare hands, he can tie knots in it. Mr. Strong is so strong, he can throw a cannonball as far as you or I can throw a tennis ball. Mr. Strong is so strong, he can hammer nails into a wall just by tapping them with his finger. Strong by name and strong by nature. Would you like to know the secret of Mr. Strong's strength? Eggs. The more eggs Mr. Strong eats, the stronger he becomes. Stronger and stronger and stronger. Anyway, this story is about a funny thing that happened to Mr. Strong one day. That morning he was having breakfast. And for breakfast he was having eggs. Followed by eggs. And to finish, he was having, guess what? That's right, eggs. That was Mr. Strong's normal breakfast. After his eggy breakfast, Mr. Strong cleaned his teeth. And, as usual, he squeezed all the toothpaste out of the tube. And, as usual, he cleaned his teeth so hard, he broke his toothbrush. Mr. Strong gets through a lot of toothpaste and toothbrushes. After that, he decided to take a walk. Put on his hat, opened the front door of his house. What a beautiful day, he thought to himself. And stepping outside his house, he shut the front door. The door fell off its hinges. Mr. Strong gets through a lot of front doors. Then Mr. Strong went for his walk. He walked through the woods. But he wasn't looking where he was going. And walked slap bang into a huge tree. The huge tree trunk snapped, and the tree thundered to the ground. Whoops, said Mr. Strong. He walked into town. And again, not looking where he was going, he walked slap bang straight to a brick wall. And Mr. Strong, being Mr. Strong, walked straight through that brick wall. Whoops, said Mr. Strong. Eventually, Mr. Strong walked through the town and out into the country, to a farm. The farmer met him in the road, looking very worried. What's the matter? Asked Mr. Strong. It's my cornfield. It's on fire, and I can't put it out. Mr. Strong looked over the hedge, and sure enough, the cornfield was blazing fiercely. Water, said Mr. Strong. We must get water to put out the fire. But I don't have enough water to put the whole field out, cried the worried farmer. And the nearest water's down to the river, and I don't have a pump. Then we'll have to find something to carry the water, replied Mr. Strong. Is that your barn? He asked, pointing to a barn in another field. Yes, I was going to put my corn in it, said the farmer. But can I use it? Asked Mr. Strong. Yes, but no buts. Come on. Mr. Strong walked over to the barn, and do you know what he did? He picked it up. He actually picked up the barn. The farmer couldn't believe his eyes. Then Mr. Strong carried the barn above his head down to the river. And he turned the barn upside down. Then he lowered it into the river so that it filled up with water. Then, and this shows how strong Mr. Strong really is, he picked it up and carried it back to the blazing cornfield. Mr. Strong emptied the upside-down barn full of water over the flame. Sizzle, sizzle, sputter, sputter. 1 minute, the flames were leaping in the air. The next minute, they'd gone. However can I thank you? The farmer asked Mr. Strong. Oh, there's nothing, remarked Mr. Strong modestly. But I must find some way to reward you, said the farmer. Well, said Mr. Strong, you're a farmer, so you must keep chickens. Yes, I do, said the farmer. Lots. And chickens lay eggs, went on Mr. Strong. And I rather like eggs. "Then you shall have as many eggs as you can carry," said the farmer, and took Mr. Strong over to the farmyard. Mr. Strong said goodbye to the farmer and thanked him for the eggs, and the farmer thanked him for helping. Then Mr. Strong, just using one finger, picked up the eggs and went home. Mr. Strong put the eggs carefully down on his kitchen table and went to close the kitchen door. The door fell off its hinges. "Whoops," said Mr. Strong, and sat down. The chair fell to bits. "Whoops," said Mr. Strong, and started cooking his lunch. And for lunch, he was starting with eggs, followed by an egg or two, and an egg between eggs, and an egg on the side, and an egg for luck, and then eggs. And then for his pudding, he was having, well, can you guess? For his pudding, he was having ice cream. This is a story about Mr. Daydream. You know what he looks like, don't you, because you've seen him at the beginning. It's also a story about a little boy called Jack, and you don't know what he looks like, so here's a picture of him. Now, Jack was a very well-behaved little boy. He always ate up his lunch, he always went to bed when he was told, he always said please and thank you. But Jack was a daydreamer. Whenever he was supposed to be thinking about something, he found himself thinking about something else. Daydreaming. One day, Jack was at school. He was sitting at his desk, listening to the teacher talking about history. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something outside the window on the grass in front of the school. It was a small, cloud-shaped something. Jack couldn't believe his eyes. The figure looked at Jack, looking at him, smiled, and waved. Jack looked at his teacher, who was still talking. Then he got up, quietly, ever so quietly, and slipped out. He crossed the grass to the strange-looking, cloud-shaped figure. "Hello," he said. "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm Mr. Daydream," said the figure. "What's your name?" "Jack," said Jack. I'm going off on an adventure," Mr. Daydream said to Jack. "Would you like to come with me?" "Oh, yes, please," replied Jack. "Very well, then," said Mr. Daydream, and putting two fingers in his mouth, he let out the loudest whistle Jack had ever heard in his whole life. A huge bird swooped down out of the sky and landed beside Jack and Mr. Daydream. "Come on," said Mr. Daydream to Jack, and climbed onto the bird's back. Jack climbed on too. It was really an enormous bird, and there was plenty of room for both of them. "Hold on," said Mr. Daydream. Jack held on, tight. The huge bird flapped its huge wings, and suddenly they were high up in the air. They flew over fields and farms and towns and hills and trees and valleys, until they were far, far away from Jack's school. It was very exciting.
Mr. Daydream turned to Jack.
How would you like to go to Africa?
He shouted. They were travelling so fast now that Jack just nodded his head and held on even tighter. And suddenly, it seemed in no time at all, there below them was Africa. The bird landed in a jungle clearing. Jack and Mr. Daydream climbed off the bird's back. It was very hot. Come on, said Mr. Daydream to Jack. Let's go and explore. So off they set, pushing their way through the jungle. Suddenly, in the middle of a clearing, they saw an elephant.
Hello, Mr. Daydream.
Trumpeted the elephant down its trunk.
Would you like a lift?
Yes, please, replied Mr. Daydream. And the elephant reached out its trunk, picked him up, and then put him on his back. Then he reached out his trunk again, picked up Jack, and put him on his back. It was very high. The elephant carried them through the jungle until they came to a river. Then he set them down on the ground, said, "Bye-bye," and went off into the jungle. How are we going to cross the river? Jack asked Mr. Daydream. Perhaps I can be of assistance, said a particularly oily voice coming up from the river. They looked, and there was a crocodile. Use my back, suggested the crocodile. It was very helpful. They were halfway across the river on the crocodile's back when the crocodile grinned a rather nasty grin. All teeth and no smile. Then, flicking his enormous tail and shooting Jack and Mr. Daydream up into the air, the crocodile opened his horribly large mouth and waited. It was very frightening. "Oh, dear," gasped Jack as he looked down at that enormous mouthful of teeth. "Oh, dear. Oh, help!" Mr. Daydream, upside down beside him, put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out that very large whistle of his. Suddenly, just as the crocodile's mouth was about to go snap, the big bird swooped down out of the sky. Mr. Daydream and Jack landed right on the bird's back. "Phew," said Jack. "Foiled again," said the crocodile. "Well, I promised you an adventure, didn't I?" grinned Mr. Daydream. "You certainly did," said Jack. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to Australia." They did. And Jack learned to throw a boomerang, so that it always came back to him. "Now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to the North Pole." And they did. And Mr. Daydream fell right up to his middle in a snowdrift. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we'll go to the Wild West." And they did. And Mr. Daydream found a huge 10-gallon cowboy hat. The trouble was, when he put it on, he couldn't see out. "Jack!" he called from underneath the hat. "Jack!" "Jack!" Suddenly, Jack realized that it wasn't Mr. Daydream saying his name. It was his teacher. And Jack wasn't in the Wild West. He was sitting at his school desk. "Jack," said the teacher again, "you've been daydreaming." It was true. He had. Or had he? Mr. Fussy was fussy about everything.
Absolutely everything had to be neat and tidy and in its proper place. Mr. Fussy spent all day and every day rearranging his furniture and making sure that the flowers grew in a straight line in his garden, and trying to find specks of dust where there couldn't possibly be specks of dust, because he spent all his time making sure that there weren't any specks of dust. One fine morning, Mr. Fussy was having breakfast. He was very fussy about what he ate. He opened the marmalade pot. "Oh," he exclaimed, "it's got bits in it." And he spent the rest of the morning separating the bits from the marmalade. Or, if you prefer, the marmalade from the bits. Fussy old fusspot, people used to call him. Then Mr. Fussy went out into his garden, and he spent the rest of the day straightening out all the blades of grass on his lawn. Fussy old fusspot. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, ironing his shoelaces, when he heard a crash outside. "What's to do?" he murmured to himself, and hurried outside to investigate. There, with a broken garden gate in one hand, and an old battered suitcase in the other, and a sheepish grin on his face, stood an untidy person, Mr. Clumsy. "Whoops," he said, holding up the garden gate. "It came off in my hand." "Who," spluttered Mr. Fussy, looking in horror at his garden gate, "are you?" "Oh, I'm Mr. Clumsy," replied the untidy person, grinning. And he stepped forward to shake Mr. Fussy's hand, but tripped over and fell on the lawn. "My grass!" cried Mr. Fussy. "My straight grass! You bent it!" And he got down on his hands and knees and started straightening the grass. "But who are you?" he asked over his shoulder. "And why are you here?" "Oh, I'm your cousin, Blue," replied Mr. Clumsy. "Your long-lost cousin from Australia. I've come to visit." "If you look hard, there is a certain family likeness between them, isn't there?" "Well, aren't you pleased to see me?" continued Mr. Clumsy cheerfully, knocking over a flower or two as he got up. He picked up his suitcase, knocking over another flower or two, or three. Mr. Fussy quite obviously wasn't pleased to see him. "Oh, you'd better come in," he muttered. "I say," remarked Mr. Clumsy, looking through the front door of Mr. Fussy's house. "I say, what a neat little place you got here." And he stepped inside, tripped over his shoelaces, but he often does, knocked over a chair, dropped his suitcase, and fell in an untidy heap on the floor. "Whoops," he said. Mr. Fussy shut his eyes and heaved a sigh and groaned silently to himself. Later that evening, after Mr. Fussy had cooked them a meal, and after Mr. Clumsy had helped with the washing up, 2 broken plates, they sat down to talk. Mr. Fussy sat, as he always did, in a neat and tidy fashion. Mr. Clumsy sat, as he always did, in a not-so-neat and tidy fashion. "How long are you staying?" asked Mr. Fussy. "Oh, I don't know," grinned Mr. Clumsy. "Few days, week, year, haven't decided." Mr. Fussy groaned another long, silent groan to himself. And they went to bed. When he woke in the morning, Mr. Fussy jumped out of bed and went into his bathroom. Oh no," he gasped. "Oh, no." Oh, yes. Mr. Clumsy had been there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor. The bath was full of water. There were pools of water all over the bathroom floor. Half a tube of toothpaste had been squeezed out onto the mirror. What a mess. Mr. Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he could. Then he hurried downstairs. "Morning," said his cousin cheerfully. "I've cooked your breakfast. Sit down." There was an awful mess everywhere. "There we are. Breakfast," said Mr. Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, broken fried eggs, towards the table. And then he tripped over those shoelaces of his, and then the eggs flew through the air, and they landed all over Mr. Fussy. Sticky, greasy, yellow, fried eggs. "Whoops," said Mr. Clumsy. After a week, Mr. Fussy's house didn't look like Mr. Fussy's house anymore. Don't you agree? But after 2 weeks, Mr. Clumsy decided to move on. "Oh, thanks for having me, sport," he said to Mr. Fussy. It was very nice to see you, replied Mr. Fussy politely. What he was thinking was not so polite. It's very nice to see you going, was what he was thinking. Well, cheerio, said Mr. Clumsy. And off he went with his battered old suitcase. Goodbye, called Mr. Fussy, really meaning good riddance. Then Mr. Fussy fussed round his house as he'd never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot. That evening, Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, polishing an egg, and he heard a crash outside. Oh, no, he groaned. Oh, not Mr. Clumsy back again. It can't be. Mustn't be. It isn't. And it wasn't. It was somebody else. Somebody who just walked straight through Mr. Fussy's garden gate. Somebody who can't help having little accidents. Somebody you may have met before. Hello, smiled Mr. Bump. I've come to visit. Ah, I thought I'd bump into you again sometime. Bump into you. Poor Mr. Worry. Whatever happened, he worried about it. If it rained, he worried that his roof was going to leak. If it didn't rain, he worried that all the plants in his garden were going to die. If he set off shopping, he worried that the shops would be shut when he got there. And when the shops weren't shut when he got there, he worried that he was spending too much money shopping. When he got home with his shopping, he worried that he'd left something behind or that something had fallen out of his basket on the way home. And when he got home and discovered that he hadn't left anything behind and that nothing had fallen out of his basket on the way home, he worried that he'd bought too much. And then he worried about where to put it all. Life was just one long worry for poor Mr. Worry. One day, he went for a walk. He was worried that he might walk too far and not be able to get home. But, on the other hand, he was worried that if he didn't walk far enough, he wouldn't get enough exercise. He hurried along worrying. Or, you could say, he worried along hurrying. He met Mr. Bump. Hey, I'm very worried about you, he said. Why's that? Asked Mr. Bump. I'm worried that one of these days you might hurt yourself, he said. Don't you worry your head about that, replied Mr. Bump, and went off, tripping over his own feet. Mr. Worry went on. He met Mr. Noisy. Hey, I'm very worried about you, he said. Why's that? Asked Mr. Noisy. Well, I'm worried that you might lose your voice, said Mr. Worry. Don't you worry your head about that, said Mr. Noisy, and went off. Clump, 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 clump. Mr. Worry went on. He met Mr. Greedy. Hey, I'm very worried about you, he said.
Why is that?
asked Mr. Greedy.
Well, I'm worried that you might eat too much and be sick,
explained Mr. Worry.
Me?
Replied Mr. Greedy.
Eat too much? Oh, impossible.
And he went off for lunch. Mr. Worry went on. He met a wizard.
Hello,
Said the wizard.
who are you?
I'm Mr. Worry.
And you look it, commented the wizard.
I tell you what,
He went on, for he was a helpful sort of wizard.
why don't you go home and write down every single thing that you're worried about, and I'll make sure that none of these things will ever happen. And then you won't have anything to worry about, will you?
Mr. Worry smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled in a long time. In fact, it was the first time he'd smiled that year. He hurried home in great excitement. When he got home, he sat down to write out all the things that worried him. Every single thing. It was a long list. And then he went to bed and had the best night's sleep he'd had in years. The following morning, the wizard came round to collect Mr. Worry's list.
My goodness me,
He said, when he saw the size of it.
However,
He said,
leave it to me. I'll go off and make sure that none of these things will ever happen.
off he went.
Nothing to worry about now.
Called over his shoulder.
Nothing at all.
Mr. Worry heaved a sigh of relief. That day was the first day in Mr. Worry's life that he didn't have a single thing to worry about. And the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Mr. Worry didn't have a care in the world. But on Monday morning, he was a worried man. Oh, dear. What do you think was worrying him? Can you guess? He went to see the wizard.
Oh, dear,
Said the wizard when he saw him standing on his doorstep.
what's worrying you now?
I'll tell you.
Said Mr. Worry.
I'm worried because I don't have anything to worry about.
And he went home to worry. Mr. Uppity was one of the rudest people in the world, if not the rudest. He was rude to anybody
and everybody. So, of course, in Big Town, which is where he lived, he had no friends at all. Not one. Miserable old uppity, they used to call him, and he certainly looked it. Now, as well as being rude, Mr. Uppity was also rich. Very rich. One of the richest people in the world, if not the richest. He had the largest, longest limousine in Big Town. He had the largest, longest garden in Big Town. He had, on the top of a hill in the middle of Big Town, the most enormous house. The biggest house in Big Town. And there he lived, all alone. Miserable old Uppity. One day, Mr. Uppity was walking in the gardens of his enormous house, when suddenly he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. Mr. Uppity looked, and there, in one of his hundreds of flower beds, was a goblin. "Are you not going to say hello to me?" said the goblin. "Go away," said Mr. Uppity rudely. "Oh, I know who you must be," said the goblin. "You must be Mr. Uppity, who's rude to everybody." Sniffed Mr. Uppity rudely. "Well, I know somebody who wants to meet you," said the goblin, and he skipped off, the way goblins do. Mr. Uppity's curiosity got the better of him. He followed. "In there," said the goblin, pointing at a small hole in a tree. "Don't be silly," snorted Mr. Uppity. Oh, I'm not being silly," said the goblin. "Yes, you are," snapped Mr. Uppity. "I can't possibly get in there." "Aha!" smiled the goblin. And then he said a magic word, known only to goblins, which sounded like wobbling, something like that. Suddenly, Mr. Uppity started shrinking. He shrank and he shrank until he was exactly the same size as the goblin. "Turn me back to my proper size at once," spluttered Mr. Uppity in a rage. "I shan't," grinned the goblin. And so saying, the goblin climbed through the hole into the tree. Poor Mr. Uppity didn't know what to do, so he followed him. Inside the tree, there was a staircase going down and down. It led directly to the kingdom of the goblins. "I demand to be taken immediately to whoever is in charge," said Mr. Uppity angrily. "Oh, you shall. So you shall," grinned the goblin. And he led Mr. Uppity through the streets of the kingdom of the goblins until they came to a palace. The goblin and Mr. Uppity passed through the gates and into a courtyard and through some more gates and along a long corridor and through some large gold doors and into a huge room. And there, sitting on a gold throne, was the king of the goblins. "Your Majesty," announced the goblin, bowing low, "may I present Mr. Uppity?" "Ah," said the king. "So you're the fellow who goes about being rude to everybody, doesn't have any friends." "Rubbish," said Mr. Uppity rudely. "I can see that what I've heard is true," said the king, looking at the indignant Mr. Uppity. "You're much too puffed up with your own importance. Therefore," he continued, "I'm going to allow you to be turned back to your proper size. But when you get back to Big Town, if you're rude to anybody at all, you will immediately shrink to the size you are now. Do you understand?" The goblin then took Mr. Uppity back through the kingdom of the goblins and up the staircase and out of the tree at the bottom of Mr. Uppity's garden. The goblin looked at Mr. Uppity and said something which sounded like "Googly-googly-googly," and Mr. Uppity grew and grew back to his original size. "Now, you remember what the king said," warned the goblin. "Don't you be so uppity in future." Mr. Uppity marched off furiously up to his enormous house. The following day, Mr. Uppity was out walking through the streets of Big Town. Suddenly, he came across a little boy playing with a ball. "Get out of my way," snapped Mr. Uppity rudely. But as soon as he'd said it, you know what happened, don't you? Yes, Mr. Uppity shrank and shrank until he was no bigger than the ball the boy was playing with. "Oh, dear," he gasped, and then he thought. "I'm sorry," he said to the boy. "What I meant to say was, please could I get past?" Immediately, Mr. Uppity grew to his original size, and the boy moved, and Mr. Uppity went on his way. Then he met an old lady carrying a large shopping basket. "Excuse me," she said to Mr. Uppity. "Could you tell me the time, please?" "No," said Mr. Uppity rudely. But as soon as he'd said it,
You know what happened, don't you? Oh, dear, he gasped, and then he thought. I'm sorry, he said to the old lady. What I meant to say was, it's 25 past 11. Immediately, Mr. Uppity grew to his original size, and the old lady thanked him, and Mr. Uppity went on his way. Then he went and bought a newspaper from a man standing on the corner of the main street in Big Town. He was just about to walk away when suddenly he stopped and thought, turned back to the man and said, "Thank you." Thank you was a word Mr. Uppity had never used before. The man smiled. A smile was something Mr. Uppity wasn't used to getting. Thank you was a word Mr. Uppity not only had never used before, but it was a word he'd never had said to him before. Mr. Uppity smiled. He felt happy. Happy was a feeling Mr. Uppity wasn't used to feeling. He liked it. And do you know, from that day forward to this day backward, Mr. Uppity is a changed person. He's still the richest person in Big Town, perhaps the richest person in the world. But now he has lots of friends, and he smiles a lot, and he never gets that shrinking feeling. And do you know which two words Mr. Uppity uses most of all these days? Please and thank you. Mr. Dizzy was, to be quite honest, not very clever. If you were to ask Mr. Dizzy what was the opposite of black, he'd say, the opposite of black is, pink. He lived in a house on a hill, which he'd built himself. A not very clever house. One of Mr. Dizzy's problems was that he lived in a country where everybody else was terribly clever. Clever land. Even the birds were clever in Cleverland. Everything and everybody in Cleverland was clever. You'll never see a worm reading a book anywhere else but Cleverland. Poor Mr. Dizzy. Everything around him was so clever that it made his head spin. One morning, Mr. Dizzy was out for a walk and he met a pig. "What's big and has big ears and a trunk?" said the clever pig to Mr. Dizzy. A mouse, said Mr. Dizzy. Pig, pig laughed sarcastically at Mr. Dizzy and went off, shaking his head. Then Mr. Dizzy met an elephant, a clever elephant. What's small and furry and likes cheese?" the elephant asked cleverly. A pig, replied Mr. Dizzy. The clever elephant laughed down his trunk. Pig, a pig, you silly man. And off he went. Poor Mr. Dizzy. Mr. Dizzy decided he didn't want to talk to anybody else that day, so he went for a walk in the wood where he knew that he wouldn't meet anybody. He felt very miserable about not being clever. And as he walked along, a tear trickled down his cheek. Poor Mr. Dizzy. Then, in the middle of the wood, he came across a well. Little did Mr. Dizzy know that it was a wishing well. The day was warm, and so he decided to take a drink of water from the well. Mr. Dizzy drank deeply, but he was still unhappy. "Oh, I do wish I could be clever," he sighed.
Little did Mr. Dizzy know that whoever drinks deeply from the water at the wishing well, his wish will come true. And Mr. Dizzy had wished that he could be clever. And his wish had come true. He was clever, but he didn't know it. Not yet. On the way home, Mr. Dizzy came across the elephant and the pig he had met earlier. They were telling each other about how they'd made Mr. Dizzy look silly by asking him a question he couldn't answer. They were giggling and sniggering about it, when they saw Mr. Dizzy approaching from the wood. "Oh, here he comes again," giggled the clever pig. "Oh, let's ask him another question," sniggered the clever elephant. Mr. Dizzy came up to them. "Tell us," said the clever pig, trying to keep a straight face, what's white and woolly and goes baa?" "Why, a sheep, of course," replied Mr. Dizzy. Pig and the elephant were amazed. To tell the truth, so too was Mr. Dizzy. He suddenly felt very, very clever. And it was a not unpleasant feeling. "Tell us," said the clever elephant, "what has 4 legs, a tail, and goes woof?" "Well, that's easy," replied Mr. Dizzy. "A dog, of course." The clever pig and the clever elephant couldn't understand how Mr. Dizzy had become so clever in one morning. Mr. Dizzy couldn't understand how he'd become so clever in one morning. But you know how he'd become so clever in one morning, don't you? "Now, let me ask you a question," said Mr. Dizzy to the pig. "You?" grunted the pig rudely. "You? Ask me a question? That was ridiculous. There's no question you could ask me that I couldn't answer." "Really?" smiled Mr. Dizzy. "Well then, can you tell me what's fat and pink and goes a tissue, a tissue?" "What's fat and pink and goes tissue, tissue?" repeated the pig, looking worried. "There's nothing that's fat and pink and goes tissue, tissue." "Nothing, eh?" said Mr. Dizzy. And he tickled the pig's nose. "Tissue, tissue," sneezed the pig. "The answer is you," said Mr. Dizzy. "You are fat and pink, and you're going a tissue, a tissue." The clever pig looked downright, if not down left, miserable. Mr. Dizzy turned to the elephant, who, incidentally, had stopped sniggering. "Now," said Mr. Dizzy, "let me ask you a question. What's large and goes dobbit, dobbit?" "What's large and goes dobbit, dobbit?" repeated the elephant, looking worried. "There's nothing that's large and goes dobbit, dobbit." "Oh, yes, there is," grinned Mr. Dizzy. "There certainly is something that's large and goes dobbit, dobbit." And he tied a jumbo knot in the clever elephant's trunk. "Stop it! Stop it!" cried the elephant, who wanted to say, stop it, but couldn't talk properly with a knot in his trunk. Mr. Dizzy grinned and went home. Hee-hee-hee-hee-hee! Mr. Topsy-Turvy was a funny sort of fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out, back to front, topsy-turvy, in fact. It was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hang upside down at the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at that clock standing on Mr. Topsy-Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsy-turviest clock you've ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy-Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. You ever seen anything like it? Now, this story is all about the time Mr. Topsy-Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody's quite sure how Mr. Topsy-Turvy got there, or where he came from. But he did arrive because somebody saw him getting off the train. The trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way. Which really isn't all that surprising, is it? Mr. Topsy-Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy-Turvy walk into his hotel carrying his suitcase upside down and with his topsy-turvy hat on his head. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "Can I help you?" Now, something you didn't know about Mr. Topsy-Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round. "Afternoon, good," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike." The manager scratched his head. You mean you'd like a room?" he asked. "Please, yes," replied Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy-Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up in the lift to a bedroom. Then Mr. Topsy-Turvy unpacked his suitcase, put on his pajamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went round the town. But what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light. "Oh, dear," said Mr. Topsy-Turvy. "I am sorry, very." Then he went into a big department store in the middle of the town. Walked up to one of the counters. "I'd like a sock of pears," he said to the lady behind the counter. "You mean a pair of socks?" she smiled, and showed him a pair of bright red socks. Mr. Topsy-Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave. But being Mr. Topsy-Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and all the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. Oh, it was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy-Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went or where he went, but he certainly went because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy-Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. "Read all it about," shouted the newspaper sellers. Instead of shouting, "Read all about it," "News is the here," said the television newsreader, instead of saying, "Here is the news." "Morning good," people started saying to each other when they met, and "Do you how?" instead of "How do you do?" Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Now, can you think of something to say that's topsy-turvy? Try on, go. I mean, go on, try. Poor Mr. Muddle just couldn't get anything right. Everything he did, everything he tried, everything he said was muddled. Totally, utterly, completely and absolutely muddled. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as hammering a nail into a wall. Now, what could get muddled with hammering a nail into a wall? Mr. Muddle could get it muddled, and frequently did. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as putting on your coat. Now, what could get muddled with putting on your coat? Well, see for yourself. Only Mr. Muddle would put his coat on like that. Imagine, for instance, something as simple as going for a walk. Now, what could get muddled about going for a walk? Well, when your legs start walking one way and you start walking the other, that's a very muddly sort of walk. Poor Mr. Muddle, walking one way and going another. Now, you'd probably like to know where Mr. Muddle lives. In a house by the sea near a place called Seatown. Mr. Muddle's house was supposed to be in the country, but Mr. Muddle, who built the house himself, had got the place muddled up, of course. This story starts one afternoon when Mr. Muddle was having his breakfast. Yeah, we know. We know you don't have breakfast in the afternoon. But you do if you get your meal times muddled up. Mr. Muddle was having bread and butter and jam and a cup of tea with milk and sugar. He spread the butter on the table, then spread the jam on the plate, then poured the milk on the bread, and then filled the cup with sugar, and then poured the tea on the bread. What a terribly muddly mixed-up breakfast. That afternoon, after breakfast, he went for a walk down the beach near his house in order to work up an appetite for supper. Met an old fisherman called George, whom he knew quite well. "Afternoon, Mr. Muddle," said George. "Good evening," replied Mr. Muddle. George smiled. "How'd you like come fishing with me?" he asked. Oh, no, please," replied Mr. Muddle eagerly. "Help me push the boat out from the beach," called George. "Right-o,"
said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat further up onto the beach. Oh, Mr. Muddle, said George, and had to show Mr. Muddle the difference between pulling and pushing. However, eventually, somehow or other, they managed to get the boat out to sea. Now, let's fish, said George, dropping a fishing line over the side of the boat. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and dropped himself over the side of the boat. Oh, Mr. Muddle, said George again. It wasn't any good. They didn't catch any fish, so they decided to go home before it became dark. Help me pull the boat up onto the beach, called George. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and pushed the boat back into the water. George was just about to say, oh, Mr. Muddle, again, when he had an idea. Smiled to himself. Help me push the boat out into the sea, George called. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and pulled the boat up onto the beach. Well done, Mr. Muddle, said George. Mr. Muddle smiled a smile and went home. George smiled a smile and went to tell everybody. The following day in Seatown, Mr. Brick, the builder, asked Mr. Muddle to hold his coat for him. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and held his ladder for him, which is what Mr. Brick really wanted. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mr. Brick, who'd been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was very pleased. Then Mrs. Scrub at the laundry asked Mr. Muddle to pass her the soap. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and passed her a clothes peg, which is what Mrs. Scrub really wanted. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mrs. Scrub, who'd also been talking to George. Mr. Muddle was extremely pleased. And then Mr. Black, the coalman, asked Mr. Muddle to lift a sack of coal down from his lorry. Right-ho, said Mr. Muddle, and lifted a sack of coal up onto the lorry, which is what Mr. Black really had wanted all along. Well done, Mr. Muddle, smiled Mr. Black. George had talked to everybody. Mr. Muddle was delighted. In fact, Mr. Muddle was so delighted that he decided to go home and cook himself a large meal to celebrate. Roast turkey, peas, potatoes, and gravy. He put the turkey in the cupboard to cook. He peeled the peas. He put the potatoes in the refrigerator to boil. And then, do you know what he did? He tried to slice the gravy. Oh, Mr. Muddle. Mr. Mean lived up to his name. He lived in what could have been a nice house, but wasn't. He never painted it, or mended the windows, or repaired the roof. Inside it was the same. No carpets, no curtains, no pictures, no fires. And Mr. Mean was so mean he made his furniture out of old orange boxes and then complained about the price of nails. Why, he was so mean. Do you know what he gave his brother for Christmas last year? A piece of coal. It wasn't as if Mr. Mean didn't have any money. Oh, no. He had lots of money. But would he spend it? Not old Meanie. Not if he could help it. One day he was sitting in his gloomy kitchen having a gloomy meal when there was a knock at the door. Drat, he said, because he didn't like people. Drat and bother. He opened the door, and there on his doorstep stood a wizard. A rather fat wizard.
Hello,
said the wizard.
I wonder if, by any chance, as it's such a warm day, you could possibly, if it's not too much trouble, be so kind as to, if it's not inconvenient, perhaps, as I'm very thirsty, provide me with, do you think, a glass, if it's not too much to ask, of water, please?
He was a very wordy wizard. No, replied Mr. Mean rudely, and shut the door in his face. How did you get in?
Well,
replied the wizard.
it was by, how shall I put it, I just, well, you know, waved the old what's-his-name magic wand, don't you know, and then, you know, well, here I am, if you know what I mean. You must be very poor,
he remarked kindly, looking round. Oh, yes, I am, lied Mr. Mean.
Then perhaps I can help you,
said the wizard, pulling up a box to sit down on. The box didn't move, so the wizard pulled it harder, and this time it did move. In fact, it tipped up and spilled Mr. Mean's money all over the floor.
Well, 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 well. Well, 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 oh, well, 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 well. It would appear to me that you, sir, are an old meanie.
Mr. Meanie didn't hear him. He was too busy scrabbling all over the floor trying to pick up his money.
And meanies need to be taught a lesson.
And so saying, he waved his magic wand. All the money turned into potatoes. Potatoes!
Oh, dear. Oh, dear me, please turn my money back into money. Oh, please, please, please. Perhaps,
replied the wizard.
But on the other hand, taking all things into account, by and large, things being what they are on the face of it, perhaps not. However,
continued the wordy wizard,
if you make me a solemn promise never to be mean again, then I'll turn the potatoes back into money. But,
he added sternly,
if you are ever mean again, then it's, how shall I put it, then it's potatoes for you, my lad, if not other vegetables as well.
The following day, Mr. Mean decided to walk to town. He never took the bus, because that cost money. On the way, he met an old washerwoman carrying an enormous bundle of washing. Oh, please, kind sir, he said. Could you possibly help me to carry this washing? It's so heavy. No, replied Mr. Mean. It's your washing. You carry it. But as soon as he'd said that, he felt a tingling in his nose. Mr. Mean's nose turned into a carrot.
Oh, no,
he gasped. The old washerwoman chuckled. And then Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Yes, oh yes, he cried in a panic. Of course I'll help you, of course. And the carrot turned back into a nose, and off he went. The old washerwoman chuckled again, and turned back into the wizard. It had been him all along, you see. Then Mr. Mean passed by a cottage garden. In the garden there was an old man chopping wood.
Excuse me, he called. Could you give an old man a bit of a hand, young fellow, my lad?
No, replied Mr. Mean. It's your wood. You chop it. But as soon as the words had passed his lips, guess what happened? His ears turned into tomatoes.
Oh, no,
he gasped. The old man chuckled. Mr. Mean remembered the wizard's words. Oh, yes, he cried. Yes, of course I'll give you a hand, of course. Mm-hmm. And he chopped and chopped until all the wood was cut. And the tomatoes turned back into ears, and off he went. Eventually, Mr. Mean arrived in the town. There was a little boy crying because his ball had got stuck on the top of the wall.
Oh, please, sir, could you make my ball down for me?
No, retorted Mr. Mean. Your ball, you... Then he stopped. There was a funny tingling feeling in his feet. Yes, he said hurriedly. Oh, yes, of course I will, of course. And and he reached up and passed the ball to the boy and went on his way, looking anxiously at his feet. The little boy stopped crying and turned into the wizard.
I think,
He said to himself,
that Mr. Mean, by and large, is beginning, if I'm not very much mistaken, to be not quite so mean. And I think, although I could be wrong, although I never am, that he has, thank goodness, learned his lesson.
and do you know something? Mr. Mean had learned his lesson. Today, he's nothing like so mean as he used to be, and he doesn't keep his money in a box in the kitchen anymore. Today, his house is mended and painted and spick and span, and he's turned into quite a generous sort of fellow. Goodness, he's so generous. Do you know what he gave his brother last Christmas? 2 pieces of coal.
Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tittletown. The people of Tittletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy. And so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him.
We must find some way of stopping his being so nosy,
said old Mr. Chips, the town carpenter.
That's right,
Said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tittletown laundry.
he needs to be taught a lesson.
If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything, said Mr. Brush, the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. Listen, he said, grinning. I have a plan. All his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tittletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and tiptoeing up to the door, he quietly opened it and peeped in. Splash went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. Oh, dear. I am so sorry, said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home and try to remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard someone laughing on the other side of the wall. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. And, standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. Snap! Went a clothes peg, right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh, dear. Oh, I am sorry, said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off down the street feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past a fence when he heard hammering. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself. Creeping very quietly to the end of the fence, he peeped round. Bang! Went a hammer, right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. Oh dear. Oh, I am sorry, said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard someone sawing wood. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and crept up behind a tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd, the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried off into Tittletown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tittletown. And that really is the end of the story, except to say that if you were ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing, a very sore nose. Mr. Chatterbox was one of those people who simply couldn't stop talking. He used to talk to anybody and everybody about anything and everything, going on and on and on. And on and on and on. And on and on and on. And when he didn't have anybody else to talk to, he used to talk to himself. Morning, Mr. Chatterbox, he used to say to himself. Morning to you, he used to reply to himself. Nice day, isn't it? Yes, it is for the time of the year. And so on, and so on, and on, and on.
The other day, Monday, I think it was, or perhaps it was Tuesday. No, I'm because it's quite a good morning, don't you agree? What are you supposed to do? That's what you said to me in the first place. No, yes, I read this hat is really, to say the least, one of the best hats I've ever seen in my life. And in my life, I must say I've seen some hats. And furthermore, it's not quite so good a morning, in my opinion, but I might be wrong, although I don't feel often.
He lived in a box-shaped house in a village. Chatterbox Cottage. One morning, the postman arrived with a letter for him. "Morning, Mr. Chatterbox," said the postman. "Oh, good morning to you, postman," replied Mr. Chatterbox. Although, as I was saying to myself only yesterday, or was it the day before, I forget. However, it's not quite so good a morning, in my opinion, but I might be wrong, although I'm not very often, as it was the other day. Monday, I think it was, or perhaps it was Tuesday, but never mind, because it is quite a good morning, don't you agree? Well, yes, of course you do, because that's what you said to me in the first place. And he went on and on and on all the morning, and the poor postman was late delivering all his letters. That afternoon, Mr. Chatterbox went into the hat shop in the village. "Hello, Mr. Bowler," he said to the man who owned the hat shop. "Do you think if it's possible that I could buy, if it's not too expensive, and I'm sure it won't be, a new hat? Because, would you believe it? Well, yes, of course you would. But anyway, as I was saying, my present hat, the one on my head, as you can see, is getting, how can I put it, a little too old. Because I've had it for, let me see now, must be, let's think, 10 years? No, I tell a lie, it can't be that long. Or can it? Well, yes, it could be. On the other hand, and he went on and on all the afternoon, half the night. Long after poor Mr. Bowler should have shut up shop and gone home. Eventually, when Mr. Bowler managed to get a word in edgeways, or was it sideways, he promised to order a new hat for Mr. Chatterbox. Then he pushed Mr. Chatterbox out of his shop, still talking, of course, and went home for his supper, which was cold, of course, because Mrs. Bowler had cooked it for him hours ago. And while he ate, he thought. Exactly 1 week later, the new hat for Mr. Chatterbox arrived. The postman delivered it to Mr. Bowler's shop. At last, said Mr. Bowler, heaving a sigh of relief. I think this hat is going to be the answer to the problem of Mr. Chatterbox talking so much. Oh, I wish it could be, said the postman. How can it? Because, replied Mr. Bowler, this hat is a magic hat. Oh, replied the postman, who didn't quite understand. That same afternoon, Mr. Bowler took the new hat round to Chatterbox Cottage. Oh, goody, said Mr. Chatterbox, seizing the hat box and opening it. It's my new hat, my lovely new hat. Oh, I couldn't wait for it to arrive. In fact, I got up early this morning because, aren't I silly? I just knew, I don't know how, but I really knew, that today would be the day. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. And it is. And here is my hat. And oh, isn't it beautiful? I can't wait to try it on. Oh, I do hope it suits me. Do you think it will? Well, of course you do. And why don't you try it on? Said Mr. Bowler, grinning. Try it on? Oh, but yes, of course I must try it on. How silly of me to stand here chattering when I haven't even tried it on yet. Yes, I will, absolutely, definitely. Try it on straight away. But anyway, because, as I said, it's silly just to talk about trying it on, isn't it? And then not to try it on, isn't it? And so he took the hat out of the box and put it on. It was a beautiful hat. I say, he said, I must say, yes, I really must, that this hat is, because it really is, to say the least, one of the best hats I've ever seen in my life. And in my life, I must say, I've seen some hats. Trilbys, bowlers, deerstalkers, balloons, fedoras, Homburgs, operas, toppers, straw cage. But while he was talking, a funny thing was happening. The more words that came out of Mr. Chatterbox's mouth, the larger his hat became. The more Mr. Chatterbox talked, the more the hat grew and grew. Mr. Chatterbox kept on talking, and the hat kept on growing. I can't see anything, he said. One minute I was standing here looking at my new hat in the mirror, and now all of a sudden, without my warning, taking me all unawares, just like that, the hat grew down to his feet. And Mr. Chatterbox stopped talking. And as soon as he stopped talking, the hat grew smaller and smaller until it was the same size as when he'd first tried it on. Mr. Bowler was delighted. My special magic hat really works, he chuckled. The following day, Mr. Chatterbox was out for a walk when he met the postman in the village. Hello, postman, he said. I said, you like my new hat? Have you ever seen such a fine hat? I'm sure you never have. What a hat. But you know what was happening, don't you? The hat grew and grew and grew the more Mr. Chatterbox talked. Oh,
Now I know what Mr. Bowler meant by a magic hat, chuckled the postman, and he went on his way, leaving poor Mr. Chatterbox speechless. He thought. Thinking. Not talking. Thinking. And you know something? That hat taught Mr. Chatterbox his lesson. And these days I don't talk half as much as I used to do, or even a quarter as much, or even a half or a quarter as much. But in short, I talk less. And you know the reason for that, don't you? Yes, of course you do. But keep it under your hat. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so, too, did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high wobbled. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. He walked into the butcher's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat,
Boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Definitely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb. And she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you've got the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
He boomed. I'm sorry, what did he say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear.
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Mr. Noisy shouted. Oh, I'm sorry, said Mrs. Crumb,
putting her hand to her ear. Could you speak up a bit, please?
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Roared Mr. Noisy. I can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Boom. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon.
I said I'd like a piece of meat.
Roared Mr. Noisy. Beg your pardon, said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed. Hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Boom. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice.
A loaf of...
Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat.
He boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon.
Yes, I did.
Shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice.
I said I'd like a...
Then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure, he said. So, carrying his bread and meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. And then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something that Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. And you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted. Especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Mr. Impossible could do the most amazing things. For instance, he could jump over a house. Impossible. And Mr. Impossible could make himself invisible. All he had to do was to stand there and think about becoming invisible, and he became invisible. Impossible. And Mr. Impossible could fly. All he had to do was stand there and flap his arms about, and off he flew. Impossible. He lived in an impossible-looking house. Have you ever seen a house in such an impossible place? Of course not. One day, he was out walking in the woods when he met a boy called William. William was on his way to school. "Hello there," said Mr. Impossible. "Hello," said William. "I'm William." "I'm Impossible." "Really?" said William. "Sure am," smiled Mr. Impossible. "Can you do impossible things?" asked William. "Haven't come across anything I couldn't do." William thought. "Can you climb up that tree?" he asked, pointing to the biggest tree in the wood. "Oh, I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can walk up that tree." And he did. William thought again. Can you stand on one hand?" he asked. "Oh, I can do better than that," replied Mr. Impossible. "I can stand on no hands." And he did. "Huh, that's impossible," cried William. "Sure is," replied Mr. Impossible. Then William remembered that he was on his way to school. "Why don't you come with me?" he asked. "But I've never been to school before." "Then it's time you did," replied William. "Come on." William and Mr. Impossible sat at the back of William's classroom with all the other children. The teacher came in, but didn't notice that there was somebody extra in his class that morning. "Morning, children," he said. "I have a very difficult sum for you to do today. It will take you most of the morning to work out the answer." And he wrote the sum on the blackboard. It really was the most difficult sum William had ever seen in his whole life, full of adding up and taking away and multiplications and divisions and other things William didn't enjoy. The teacher was right. It would indeed take up most of the morning to work out the answer, if not most of the afternoon as well. Mr. Impossible whispered in William's ear. William put up his hand. "Yes, William," said the teacher. "Is there something about the sum that you don't understand?" "Please, sir," said William. "Is the answer 23? Teacher was very, absolutely, totally, completely amazed. "How did you work out the sum so quickly?" he gasped. "It's impossible." "Ain't nothing impossible, mister," said Mr. Impossible from the back of the class, and stood up. "Well, I never did," exclaimed the teacher. After that, Mr. Impossible spent all day at the school. He showed the teacher how he could read a book upside down. "But that's impossible," said the children who were watching. "Yes, sir," said Mr. Impossible. Then William asked Mr. Impossible if he'd like to play in the school football match. "We sure would," replied Mr. Impossible, "but I ain't never played football before." And you know what he did? He kicked the football so high into the air that when it came down, it had snow on it. Impossible. Then it was time to go home. Mr. Impossible said goodbye to all the people at school, and then he said goodbye to William. "Goodbye, Mr. Impossible," said William. "So long, William," said Mr. Impossible. He just disappeared. William rubbed his eyes and went home. William's mother and father were waiting for him. "Hello, William," they said. "Did you have a good day at school?" "Yes," he replied. "And I met someone who can do anything in the world." Oh, really, William?" They both laughed. You're impossible. William smiled and went inside. And 100 miles away, a small figure was listening to what William's mother and father were saying. And then he went to sleep, standing on his head. And we all know that that is downright impossible.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lazy lives in Sleepyland, which is a very lazy-looking and sleepy-like place. Birds in Sleepyland fly so slowly they sometimes fall out of the sky. The grass takes so long to grow, it only needs cutting once a year. Even the trees are lazy-looking and sleepy-like. And do you know what time everybody gets up in Sleepyland? The answer is they don't get up in the morning. They get up in the afternoon. And incidentally, this is what a Sleepyland clock looks like. Everything takes so long to do, there's only time for 4 hours a day. Anyway, this story starts with Mr. Lazy being fast asleep in bed. In Sleepyland, they call that being slow asleep. He spends rather a lot of time in bed. It's his favorite place to be. He opened his eyes, yawned again, went back to sleep. Later, Mr. Lazy opened his eyes again, yawned again, went back to sleep again. Much later, Mr. Lazy got up and went to make his breakfast. We say breakfast, although really it was tea time. He put the kettle on to make some tea. Kettles take 2 hours to boil in Sleepyland. Then he toasted a slice of bread. Bread takes 3 hours to go brown in Sleepyland. Toast never gets burnt there. While he was waiting for his kettle to boil and his bread to toast, Mr. Lazy went into the garden of Yawn Cottage, which is where he lived. Sat down on a chair, and you can probably guess what happened next. That's right. He yawned. He yawned again. I went to sleep. Suddenly, he woke with a jump, which is something that doesn't happen very often to Mr. Lazy. And the reason he woke with a jump was because of the noise. Wake up, was the noise. Wake up, wake up, wake up. There were 2 men standing in front of him. I'm Mr. Busy, said one of the men. And I'm Mr. Bustle, said the other. Come along now, said Mr. Bustle busily. We can't have you sleeping all day, added Mr. Busy, bustling Mr. Lazy to his feet. Who are you? Who are you? We're Bustle and Busy. Oh. Come along now, haven't got all day. But, no time for buts, said Mr. Busy. Or ifs, added Mr. Bustle. There's the wood to chop and the beds to make and the floors to clean and the coal to get and the windows to polish and the plates to wash and the furniture to dust and the grass to cut and the hedges to clip and the food to cook. And the clothes to mend, added Mr. Busy. Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Lazy in a daze. The wood to clean and the beds to get and the floors to cut and the coal to cook and the windows to make and the plates to mend and the furniture to chop and the grass to wash and the hedges to dust and the clothes to clip. He'd got it all completely wrong. He was in such a daze. Then Bustle and Busy set Mr. Lazy to work. chopping and making and cleaning and getting and polishing and washing and dusting and cutting and clipping and cooking and mending. Not to mention all the fetching and carrying. Poor Mr. Lazy. Now, they said, when he'd finished, it's time for a walk. And off they set on the longest walk Mr. Lazy had ever been on. Mr. Lazy is one of those people who never walks when he has a chance of sitting down, and never sits down when he has a chance of lying down. But this day, he had no choice. They made him walk for miles and miles and miles, until he felt that his legs must be worn right down to his body. Poor Mr. Lazy. When they arrived back at Yorn Cottage, Mr. Busy said, "Right, now for a run." "Oh, no." "When I blow this whistle," said Mr. Bustle, producing whistle, "you've got to start running, as fast as you can," added Busy. Mr. Lazy groaned a deep groan and closed his eyes. Mr. Bustle put the whistle to his lips. Went the whistle. Mr. Lazy, poor Mr. Lazy, started to run, but his legs weren't getting him anywhere. He opened his eyes and looked down to see why, and the reason his legs weren't getting him anywhere was because he was sitting on a chair in the garden. And there was no sign of Mr. Busy or Mr. Bustle. It had all been a terrible dream. And the whistle was the whistling kettle boiling in the kitchen. Mr. Lazy heaved a sigh of relief. And then he went into the kitchen and sat down to have his breakfast and to think about his dream. But you know what happened next, don't you? Wake up, Mr. Lazy. Wake up, wake up, wake up. It was a lovely summer evening, and in Crosspatch Cottage, Mr. Grumpy was at home. He sat down in an armchair and picked up a book. And then, do you know what he did? He tore all the pages out of it, every one. Mr. Grumpy can't stand books. He has a shocking bad temper. In fact, he's quite the most bad-tempered person you can imagine. Grumpy by name, and even more grumpy by nature. The following morning, he was out in his garden pulling up flowers. He couldn't stand pretty flowers growing in his garden. When out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure. It was Mr. Happy. "Good morning," said Mr. Happy. "Good," said Mr. Grumpy. "What's good about it?" "But," said Mr. Happy. "But nothing," went on Mr. Grumpy. "Get out of my garden." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Happy. "You heard me," snapped Mr. Grumpy. "Go away." "I say," laughed Mr. Happy, "you're a bad-tempered fellow." "Hum," grunted Mr. Grumpy. "And," went on Mr. Happy, Bad-tempered fellows need to change their ways. Rubbish, retorted Mr. Grumpy, and went into his cottage, deliberately stepping on Mr. Happy's foot as he passed him. Oh, said Mr. Happy. Bang went the door of Crosspatch Cottage as Mr. Grumpy slammed it behind him. Mr. Happy stood there looking not quite so happy as he normally does. His foot hurt. He thought and thought and thought some more. Then he had an idea. He smiled and went to see Mr. Tickle. Mr. Happy told Mr. Tickle of his idea of how to get Mr. Grumpy to change his ways. And Mr. Tickle grinned the sort of grin that goes from ear to ear. That is, if you have ears, which he doesn't. Oh, he grinned, rubbing the hands at the end of those extraordinarily long arms of his together. That sounds fun. That afternoon, Mr. Grumpy went to town, shopping. He walked into Mr. Meat's shop. Mr. Meat was a butcher. "Give me some sausages," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "and be quick about it." Poor Mr. Meat, who was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, did as he was told. But as he was doing as he was told, something appeared through his shop doorway. Do you know what it was? It was an extraordinarily long arm belonging to... Well, you can guess who it belonged to, can't you? That extraordinarily long arm of Mr. Tickle's came in through the door and across the shop, up to Mr. Grumpy, and tickled him. "Ow!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy in alarm, dropping his sausages and looking round to see what had happened. But could he see anything? He could not. Grunted Mr. Grumpy, and picked up his sausages and went next door to the cake shop. Crash went the door of the shop. "Give me a cake," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "and hurry up." Poor Mrs. Fairy, who sold cakes, was frightened of Mr. Grumpy, so she did as she was told. But as she was doing as she was told, guess what happened? "Oh!" squeaked Mr. Grumpy, dropping his cake and his sausages. He just could not understand what was happening. And the same thing happened at Mr. Daly's, the newspaper shop, at Mrs. Humbug's, the sweet shop, and at Mr. Bottler's dairy, and at Mr. Packet's, the grocer's. It went on all afternoon. And all afternoon, Mr. Grumpy kept being tickled. Dropping his shopping, picking it up and being tickled, and dropping his shopping and picking it up and being tickled and dropping his shopping and... Oh, he just couldn't understand it. On his way home to Crosspatch Cottage, he met Mr. Happy again. "Hello," grinned Mr. Happy. Having a nice day?" "Get out of my way," snapped Mr. Grumpy, "before I kick you." But almost before the words had passed his lips, that extraordinarily long arm of Mr. Tickle's had appeared from behind a tree and tickled him yet again. He jumped in the air and dropped all his shopping yet again and fell over. Mr. Happy looked down at Mr. Grumpy lying amid a jumble of sausages and cake and newspapers and sweets and milk and cornflakes. I think he laughed that if you were to change your ways and not be quite so bad-tempered quite so often, this sort of thing might not happen to you quite so often. "Oh," grunted Mr. Grumpy. He picked up all his shopping yet again and went home to Crosspatch Cottage. But on his way, he did think about what Mr. Happy had said, because he very definitely did not like what had happened to him that afternoon. Mr. Happy and Mr. Tickle laughed and shook hands. And so after that, Mr. Grumpy did try not to be quite so bad-tempered quite so often. And the more he tried, the less he found he was tickled. And so he tried more and more. And these days, he's quite a changed person. Why, only the other evening, he picked up a book, and you know what? He only tore out one page.